Thanks so much for being here today on this lovely Wednesday afternoon. It's an absolute pleasure to be here with you all. It's my first time giving an undergraduate research talk, and it's really exciting to be able to talk about my research and the work I do in sort of a new modality in a new place under, the spotlight. Yeah, very different than the usual lecture space that we're in. As Dr. Smith said, my name is Dr. Michael Drake. I am an assistant professor in the Department of Environment and Sustainability. And today I'm going to be giving you a talk about a new project that I've been working on that has the goal of trying to create a new narrative for how we describe, contextualize, and motivate people to participate in global wildlife conservation. I'll be walking you through my background that led to this idea, this sort of logical I'm building on, but I'll also be asking you to think about a couple things with me along the way. And one of the first things I'll ask you to do is think about this title, because I still haven't figured out the right thing to call this talk and would love some feedback at the end of it. What do you think I should call this project? But let me tell you where we're going first. So I'll start off by giving you some background about who I am as a biologist, the things that I am motivated by, and also how those motivations, the experiences I've had have shaped how I think about wildlife, and led me to understand that there's this really weird and not very talked about issue in the world of wildlife conservation, especially at the global level. I'll help outline that idea and what some of those challenges are, and then I'll talk a bit about the work I'm doing and one new way I think we can approach that. And then we'll end with some ideas about wildlife as a form of culture and identity. So, before we begin, my turn to ask you something. I'd like you all to just think about these two questions really fast. Can you think of, in your head, 3 wildlife species, so like non-domestic, free-roaming species that you associate with the United States, and then 3 you associate with Colorado? It's like when we talk about these physical spaces, these geopolitical entities, what animals come to mind? And I don't want to hear your answers now, but I want you to remember them, because when we get back to this at the end of the conversation, I want to hear what you were thinking of and if the animals that resonate in your head line up with how I'm sort of picturing this relationship between identity, culture, and wildlife. Where did I start off? I've been lucky enough to know I really liked wildlife, animals, and being outside pretty much since I was a teenager. The second I set foot at university, I knew I wanted to be an ecologist, and spent a lot of my time just figuring out exactly what kind of ecologist I wanted to be. My very first project was working on steppe grasses in Mongolia, and that was a lot of fun. And the main thing it taught me is that I'm not a plant biologist. I, in fact, a wildlife guy. I really like animals, specifically animals that live on land, because the ocean is big and terrifying, and I don't really get how it works. So I'm very much a terrestrial vertebrate ecologist. As I got off the ground, I originally wanted to just go and learn a ton about wildlife. I viewed wildlife through a very disciplinarian, straight biology lens. I wanted to be an ecologist, wear khaki and learn all the animal facts, and go to all these weird places in the world that had cool critters that I'd been seeing on documentaries. Just picture National Geographic, and that was what I viewed for myself in my future. As I was getting off the ground, I was very, very fortunate to be able to work in a lot of different spots as an undergraduate. So I started off in the University of Pennsylvania. After I was done with my time as a plant ecologist, I started working with neotropical primates, got to study owl monkeys and howler monkeys, spent some time in northern Argentina. There's me holding a armadillo that did not give me any diseases. It was great. I worked in Mongolia, as I said, and spent some time in the tropical forests of Australia. As you can see right now, these are all kind of far-flung spots that have cool ecosystems and cool critters. And my motivation really was just get out there, see neat animals. After I graduated, I kept this going. I worked as a research technician and received a Fulbright fellowship from the Department of State that let me spend some time in Namibia. So during that phase of my life, I was in Iceland studying aquatic midges, Namibia working with pangolins, which is this weird critter you can see right here that looks a lot like a pine cone but isn't, and also spent some time up in Ethiopia just looking at some gelada baboons. And this was really the moment in my life where suddenly things flipped. I was still sort of on that drive to go out and just see cool wildlife in neat places, but suddenly I was realizing that the work I was doing wasn't leading me in the direction that I thought it was. Instead of just trying to learn more about wildlife, suddenly I was realizing that the work I wanted to do was really driven more by the intersection of humans and wildlife, thinking about how the way people live, the decisions we make, and the governance that we put into place really dictates whether or not humans can coexist and what the future of conservation looks like. And then into graduate school, I kept doing more of that, this time with a lot more of a goal of studying that intersection of humanity and non-human living organisms. So spent some time in North Carolina, not always holding squirrels, but also sometimes studying coyotes. Went back to Southern Africa and worked in Botswana, Namibia, and Zambia, and then also got to work as essentially a glorified tour guide in Madagascar for a little bit. And then lastly, right where this fox is smiling up here, made my way out to Colorado, where I've been for the last almost a decade now. So we'll come back to this map here in a second. I promise this wasn't me just like showing off pictures of me holding animals, but there really is a goal that we'll circle back to there. But before I do that, we unfortunately have to talk about sort of the elephant in the room of conservation, which is that wildlife conservation, the environmental studies approach towards thinking about wildlife, exists because we are truly in a moment of crisis. Wildlife have been on this planet for a really long time. Humans have walked the earth for at least 300,000 years. And only in the last century or so has the relationship between humans and non-humans sharing the planet shifted so dramatically. We live in a world that looks nothing like what it did a few centuries ago and is constantly changing year to year, decade to decade. So if any of you have taken a class with me, you're about to see some figures that you've seen before. They show up in almost every class I teach. But this is a classic one right here. This shows the different kinds of land use on the earth right now, grouped by different types. And you can see on your left in red is all the land that we use for livestock production on the planet. If you took all the pasture grounds, all the feedlots, all the areas where humans are growing crops specifically to feed livestock, not to feed humans directly, and put it together, it would actually be the number one source, or the number one land use on the entire planet. 27% of all the usable land on Earth is devoted to raising livestock for human. And you'll see that that actually outpaces the amount of forests or freshwater or croplands that we have. Similarly, the division of energy and biomass on the planet is really, really lopsided at this moment. This is a fun well, not fun, but a well-represented XKCD comic showing the biomass of terrestrial mammals on the planet. So each one of these squares right there represents 1 million tons of just living stuff for mammals that walk on the land. So no ants, no fish, no whales, things like that. And broken into 3 groups. Right in the center, you can see humans. That big, darker blob in the middle is about 8 billion of us on the planet right now. We're actually quite large animals. I'm bigger than most mountain lions, it turns out. If you ever saw something the size of me walking around the forest, you'd be like, wow, that's a big animal out there. And there's a lot of us. But we are vastly, vastly, vastly dwarfed by the animals that we bring with us, with our domestic livestock. Animals that we use for production to support our livelihoods, animals that we eat, animals that we have for companionship. And you can see on the left there, that giant gray banana, that huge arc over there is just cows. Cows are incredibly massive when you think about all the biomass on the planet. And all of those gray livestock blocks right there just really dominate and dwarf the wild mammals of our planet, which are those tiny little green blocks. So you can see right in the center, there is one single square that represents all of the elephants on the planet. And inside of those green squares is every squirrel and primates and rodents and weasel and pangolin that is currently on the planet right now. It really amounts to very little. In fact, if you divide it all out, wild mammals only account for about 4% of the biomass of all of our terrestrial mammals, and birds follow a similar sort of pattern, though it's a little less skewed because humans aren't birds and we're not on the scale as well. Wild birds are only about 30% of the biomass of all birds on the planet. And without going into too many details, you can think of biomass as sort of a proxy for energy. There's only so much energy out there, only so much food, only so many avenues for turning solar energy into living organisms. And this sort of shows how much of that energy, space, food, resources is being locked up in human systems. I'm not saying all of this just to make us feel bad about things, but just to show that it wasn't always this way. There weren't even a billion humans till the year 1800. For most of the existence of humans on this planet, the ratio was much the opposite. Lots of wildlife out there, not a lot of humans. And we are living right at that inflection point where things have dramatically flipped around. And the reason we bring this up is because we're in a time where global conservation is more important now than ever. Not only in understanding the biological principles behind it, but actually figuring out how to implement stuff. What do we need to do as a people, as a planet, as a community to put the right resources in the right spots, to make the right decisions, to actually execute on protecting and conserving the wildlife that we have left, knowing that we're sort of down to the tiniest little slice of what there used to be. If you look at just birds in the United States, we're down about 30% of all birds since the year 1970. And that's by no means, a pristine era of perfect birds, but in a lifetime, we've lost a huge percentage of birds. By all metrics, we're on path to being in a mass extinction. For anyone that hasn't taken Con Bio, a mass extinction is defined as when you lose 75% of the species on the planet in 2 million years or less, 2 million years being a pretty short period of time geologically. And right now, humans are on pace for achieving that goal in about 37,500 years, which is nothing compared to the 2 million year timeline that we usually subscribe to that. So we are in a moment of wildlife collapse that is akin to an asteroid hitting the planet, or huge tectonic action, or massive warming or cooling of the planet that we've seen in earlier geological epochs. And these trends are not necessarily new, but they are happening a lot faster now than before. This is an interesting one showing all the megafauna of the major continents that are still on the planet now, the extant megafauna, versus the things that went extinct since the end of the last ice age, since the end of the Pleistocene. And you can see we've lost a lot of really big animals in a lot of spots. In fact, continents like South America have very few of the large animals that used to be there not that long ago. The Pleistocene only ended, call it 14,500 years ago, but within the existence of humans as anatomically modern organisms, there were giant sloths, huge cave bears, dire wolves, smilodons, a whole bunch of different lineages of elephant-type things, all sharing spaces that humans existed on all of these continents. Some of my favorites are the huge wombats and the 12-foot tall kangaroos that used to be able to find in Australia have all disappeared in the time that humans have been around. And looking forward, things also look dire. Not only are we in a mass extinction, but this mass extinction is really disproportionately hitting large-bodied animals, especially things that live on land. In short, the organisms that inhabit the spaces that humans impact most directly and want to expand into are most likely to go extinct first. I'm not going to try to explain all the details of this figure right here, but this came from an interesting paper showing that there is a disproportionately large chance or probability of going extinct for organisms related to their body size, with larger organisms going extinct faster. And projecting this trend forward, this paper projected that the cow would be the largest terrestrial animal by the year 2200 if we stay on the track that we are right now. All right, so that's all the dire stuff. I have to say all this stuff to show that we need to really think about conservation and take it seriously. This is a lesson that I didn't know when I was younger. Again, I was out there to just go learn about animals. My goal to get into biology wasn't to solve a really pressing and dire global issue. It was just to learn animal facts, not be around people that I didn't want to talk to. And now my motivation comes from a very different place. What can we do to address this big issue? Because I fundamentally believe these things can change. This is not the first time we have seen very catastrophic wildlife collapses in this space that we're in right now. This figure right here shows trends in deer population for both mule and white-tailed deer in North America, going from the 1400s till now. And you can see that at the turn of the 18 to the 1900s, deer collapsed in North America. This is at the same time when the Carolina parakeet goes extinct, when the passenger pigeon goes extinct, when turkeys in Colorado get down to 250 individuals. If you're in the early 1900s in Colorado, there was about as many turkeys as you have seats in this room, and we have rebounded immensely. And deer almost went extinct. In the country, there was 1% of the deer that we have today, which is kind of wild to think about now, given that you can go outside and sometimes see more deer than people on campus. But there has been a really massive recovery of deer populations and many other game species in North America in the last 100 years or so. It's a pretty big conversation for a different time, but I do love talking about the specifics for that. But we can think for a second, what actually caused us to reverse that change? Was it that we got better at biology, that we wrote more papers, that we understood the actual dynamics of populations and vital rates better in a way that let us keep up with this crash? Well, I'll tell you right now that the answer is no. What changed was a huge systemic shift in how the United States, as kind of a dominant cohesive culture, viewed wildlife and the policy that went into it. A massive change in how humans related to wildlife that came from not necessarily biology, but from just general opinions of people and what we wanted to do and how we wanted to relate to wildlife. And it really did change the trajectory of wildlife populations in North America. So let's get back to this picture right here. I'm young, I'm right out of college, I'm bopping all around the world, I'm seeing all these cool critters, and I'm also realizing that no matter where I go to all these really low density population or places of low human density, I'm still seeing really large impacts on wildlife. Well, I realized that I was following sort of the trend of most biologists, which is to think about wildlife in terms of hotspots. Like, where in the world do you want to go to see the most animals? Where are the most unique habitats and ecosystems that like have things that no one else does? This is a totally fine way to view the world. Like, there are things called ecosystems. Some of them have more organisms than others. And some places truly are biodiversity hotspots. Biodiversity can be defined a lot of different ways, but one of the simplest ways to think about it is just which places have the most species of stuff. Coral reefs have a lot more fish species than like other benthic environments out in the ocean. Rainforests have a ton of pretty much everything compared to a desert or an ice sheet. There truly are places with a lot more wildlife and a lot more species. I know it's really hard to read out there, but off the definition that this figure is giving right here for what a hotspot is, it says in that tiny little font right there, extraordinary places that harbor vast numbers of plants and animal species found nowhere else. One of the things that this figure is using to identify hotspots is the idea of endemism, or things that are endemic. I'll define that word really quickly because we'll be using it a lot today. Endemic means an organism that is found in only one place. Place can be sort of however you want to define it, one state, one forest, one island, one country, one continent, sort of whatever geographic scale you want. But sometimes there's organisms that live in one place and nowhere else. You know, the counter of that would be something like a pigeon. You can go to pretty much any country on the world right now and find pigeons. It's a species we all share and love. But then there's plenty of things that you will only find in one habitat on the planet. And this is how biologists tend to think about ecosystems. What are places that have lots of concentrations of unique wildlife, and how are they united in terms of the actual underlying natural resources, ecosystems, physical processes that enable that biodiversity to flourish? So I'm about to attack that idea a lot today, but I will say one last time, there's nothing wrong with thinking about things in terms of endemism and ecosystems. It is a truly valid way to view the world. In fact, something I wish more people like had appreciation for. However, when I moved to North Carolina, I started to really think differently about that. Who here has ever been to North Carolina or anywhere in the Southern Appalachians? Yeah, weirdly, a lot of North Carolina and Colorado overlap. Having grown up in Seattle, I never really thought too much about the Southeast, so it was sort of a surprise to me when I got down there and realized that North Carolina is pretty special. In fact, I'm gonna swap that photo of me holding a squirrel to a beautiful picture of a monarch butterfly. I saw so much wildlife when I was living down there that I didn't realize was just part of the Southeast. It turns out it's a really unique place in terms of the organisms that live around you, whether it's fish, amphibians, mammals, birds, insects. There's a lot of stuff going on down there. And that was news to me because I had mostly lived west of the Mississippi most of my life in the United States. I had this idea in my head that, well, these areas out west have big tracts of land, tons of federally managed areas, not as many humans, big empty spaces. That's got to be the spot where like animals are really flourishing. Those have to be spots that are worth protecting because why else would they be protected as the nature spots out there? It made me really think critically. All right, well, why is the distribution of our federal land really weird? There's a lot of answers to that. I won't necessarily go into all of them right now, but the thing I wanted to get to, and the thing that really flipped in my mind in living in North Carolina, was this idea that like, oh, federal land isn't there because a bunch of scientists got together and said, what are the places that we want to protect? We don't put a national forest on a forest because it is the best forest to protect. And we sure don't put national parks in places because it is where there is the most biodiversity and the most unique animals. Because it turns out, if you just look at the map, they don't line up at all. When you think about unique organisms in the US against across any taxonomic lineage, the Southeast is really where it's at. Whether you're into reptiles, trees, amphibians, the Southeast is the place where you find the most cool and unique organisms. In fact, the Smoky Mountain area of the Southern Appalachians has the highest salamander density of anywhere on the planet. It is the #1 spot to go flip over rocks and look for weird little jelly-filled salamanders. It's great. Comparatively, Colorado has one species of salamander. They really rock when it comes to that. However, who's got more national parks? Colorado does. Because it turns out the motivations for how we choose to govern landscapes, how we choose to protect wildlife and places, isn't necessarily just driven by a bunch of scientists sitting around empirically determining what's best. It's driven by ideology and representation and vibes and general, zeitgeist of what people want. Here's a photo of me when I was an 18-year-old working out in Yosemite on my lunch break. Back then I was working at this little gift shop, just slinging hot dogs and t-shirts and things like that. And it was great to be able to go on my lunch break, stand over a giant cliff and see this iconic rock, Half Dome, Tissisack. That's like this unique representation of the United States. We could get in a car right now and 3 hours later, depending on traffic, be in Arches National Park and go look at Delicate Arch and line up with everyone that's ready to take the shot of Delicate Arch right at sunset, hang out with the dozens of other people there to be out in the empty desert all together, and realize this park is here because it represents something more than just the physical space and the organisms that live there. It's protecting an iconic spot of the United States. So many of our parks, so many of our national monuments are like that. The Grand Canyon, the Statue of Liberty, all these places are protected because of more than just, asking ourselves what are the most vulnerable places in need of protection. So this idea of this disjuncture between where management is happening, where governance is, gazetting out places to protect versus which areas might actually be more worthy of protection from a purely biological lens, got me thinking more about my experiences internationally, because you see the same thing at a global scale. Totally fine to break down the world into ecosystems and think about what are our general biomes on the planet. And then when you look closer, you'll realize that the world isn't cut up into discrete biomes that all fit together. The world's cut up into these random, strange polygons that we call nation states that are overlaid on top of the biomes around us. Sometimes they line up nicely, and sometimes they are just totally bonkers and do not line up with the landscape around them at all. Actually, this would have been a great spot for me to put in a map of the state of Colorado. We're a giant square that is in the weirdest place you could ever put a square, where we have one huge ridge down the middle, two totally different ecosystems, two totally different drainages right there. You really should shift Colorado to the left or the right and line it up with the continental divide. It would make a lot more sense. Instead, we are two states in one weird square altogether. And the same thing happens in the world all the time. So, as Dr. Smith said, I did a lot of my dissertation work in this place called the Kavango-Zambezi Transfrontier Conservation Area, which is a mouthful. We like to call it CAZA because it's a little bit easier. It's this weird sort of a dinosaur foot-looking place right there in gray, and it's one giant cohesive ecosystem that has just a huge reservoir of wildlife. It's where all the elephants are. It's where all the painted dogs are. It's where most of the cheetahs are. It's there with the Masai Mara as the spot for wildlife in Africa, the two last spots where you really have massive groups of wildlife living sort of unimpeded. But you can also see that this cohesive ecosystem is broken up into 5 different countries. Not for any real good reason, but because that's just how the chips fell after a couple hundred years of things shaking up the geopolitics. So also like Dr. Smith said, one of my favorite things to figure out and one of the aha moments was realizing why Namibia has the panhandle that it does. Because it turns out it's weirder than you'd think. You might look at it and be oh, maybe there's just some sort of strange feature that connects it. You can go look at the Gambia, for example, which is in the middle of Senegal, and it's along a river. The Gambia looks very strange, but it is just the floodplain of a river, and it sort of makes sense because it lines up with a geographic feature. That's absolutely not the case for Namibia. In fact, the panhandle of Namibia breaks up a bunch of cultural and environmental boundaries. It should follow the Zambezi River, but it doesn't. It, in fact, crosses it and unites these two totally different ecosystems. And the reason for that is a sort of accidental byproduct of colonization. Namibia, during the colonial period, was a holding of Germany, called at the time German Southwest Africa. It was a place with lots of really interesting narratives and through lines in terms of the relationships between the indigenous people of Namibia and what the Germans were doing out there. Another rabbit hole that I'm going to avoid for right now, but something really interesting to look at. If you want to go down, or here's some really cool stories, go look up Hendrik Witbooi right here, who led the Nama resistance against the Germans, and the Germans then pushed back with their first concentration camps that they ever made. But one person that left a big mark, well, 2 people, were this guy right here, General Caprivi, and then Kaiser Wilhelm II. Together they got together and came up with this plan to unite the German holdings of German Southwest Africa in modern-day Namibia with Tanganyika, which is modern-day Tanzania. They had this idea that if you could get to the river systems, you could unite the two and have this big inland German-African empire. And this turned out to be really dumb for 2 different reasons. One, 3 years later, Germany loses World War I and no longer has any sort of claim to these spaces, so didn't get off the ground there anyways. And two, Victoria Falls is right between the middle of them. Sure, you can go to those river systems, but you have one of the biggest waterfalls in the world stopping you from like going through those areas. It's like physically impossible to do the thing that they were trying to do anyways. So the shape of Namibia is defined by one bad idea that like two guys had a couple hundred years ago that they didn't even get to like try, that exists for no real reason, but it's forever shaping the shape of Namibia. It is there because Kaiser Wilhelm thought he could get to the Zambezi River, and that would eventually get him to Tanzania. And now today, 100-something years later, or 200-something years later, we are thinking about this ecosystem, thinking about wildlife there, and trying to deal with the fact that Namibia is shaped the way it is because of that to this day. Just a couple things to like demonstrate that. The longest, by longest I mean most vertical distance traveled by any mammal species in Africa, the longest migration starts in Namibia and ends in the Makgadikgadi salt pans of Botswana. It's done by a bunch of zebra, and you can see that these zebra don't follow national boundaries. They in fact start up in the Zambezi region of Namibia and then walk all the way down to central Botswana and back up. Biggest remaining, or longest remaining migration in the, on the continent is broken up by the fact that this weird panhandle is right there. Similarly, northern Botswana has a huge number of elephants. You can actually see that Namibia right there kind of doesn't have as many elephants, but of course, a lot of those elephants that are counted as being part of Botswana will go into Namibia for an afternoon, cross that river, and come right back. So they're also there. Sometimes they'll walk across Namibia into Zambia and then back to Botswana in the same day. So the fact that that panhandle is there really thinks about how we manage spaces for elephants and crop breeding and management. Things are in flux right now, but like at the time I was out there, Botswana didn't have elephant hunting, but Namibia did, and Zambia didn't. So as an elephant was like crossing this river and crossing Namibia, they would spend a little bit of time sort of walking across a strip where elephant hunting was legal. And as much as we want to think about these landscapes as like single ecosystems, we have to remember that the governance of them happens at these national levels. So this is the old president of Botswana who had, I thought, a really interesting statement when he was trying to deal with like the huge number of elephant encounters and conflicts that were happening in northern Botswana. It bamboozles me when people sit in the comfort of where they come from and lecture us about the management of species they don't have. Talking about the rest of the world getting mad at Botswana when they said they were going to go and cull some elephants because the elephants were killing and damaging the livelihoods of people in Botswana because they are the government that is in charge of the spot that the elephants are in. And you see this all the time. Here's Yao Ming, who became a huge savior of elephants and helped ban the ivory trade. There's Donald Trump Jr. On an elephant safari and helped put in policies to open up the trophy policies for the United States for a while. And there is the Botswanan government handing out chairs made from elephant stools to a coalition of government members from 5 different countries that were getting together to think about whether they were going to open up local ivory markets again. The nation states that are in charge of putting in policy have a huge, in fact, an outsized effect in deciding what happens to the wildlife of those areas. And like we said before, the shapes of these countries aren't necessarily in line with like where the hotspots are or where the ecosystems are. It really is a unit of management that we need to think about. And lastly, the whole world is connected right now, of course. International trafficking happens country to country, place to place. And it's something where you can have one country set one set of policies, but if the whole world isn't pushing together to really address large-scale wildlife impacts, it kind of all falls apart. And I'd break it down to 2 big issues with this idea of nation-state governance. First, that wildlife are largely shared between nations. So it raises this question of like, who's in charge of protecting a species when it spans multiple boundaries? And secondly, most wildlife aren't adorable foxes like this. Most wildlife are not endemic or charismatic. It's a lot of weird fish you've never heard of and frogs living in a hole somewhere. How do we come up with reasons to protect those animals when there isn't something built in? So for that first one, I'll bring up the example of giraffes. Giraffes are cool, they're charismatic, they're not doing great, they're actually declining really heavily all across the world. You can see their older range in gray right there where they used to be found across Africa, and now where the 3/1 species, depending on how you want to count them, are today. They're spread out between a lot of countries, but they've also contracted a lot in their range, and their populations have declined hugely. So should every country that has giraffes left be like, all right, we got to protect the giraffes? Or just the places where they're doing well and have a better chance of protecting them, or more money to put into it, or are more stable? Does it matter for giraffes at large if Uganda, this country right there, still has giraffes or not, given that it's such a small percentage? Like, If giraffes disappear from there, does it matter for large-scale giraffe conservation? Whose job is it to be the people that stand up and protect giraffes when a dozen different countries all are part of that conversation? And by the way, a little hint of the findings of my study. Turns out that most vulnerable species are found in many countries. In fact, the average range of a vulnerable species spans 3.24 different countries. And vulnerable, by the way, is the IUCN definition, or one category. And one of the ways you can classify it is a species that has had more than a 50% population decline in 10 years or 3 generations. It doesn't sound like that scary of a word until you actually look at the definition, but that's a cataclysmically huge decline. So if the average number of countries that a vulnerable country is, a vulnerable species is 3, that means we have these animals that are really experiencing huge declines where their future is being co-managed by 3 or more different countries that may or may not be in alignment about how they want to go forward. All right, switching gears a little bit. Can anyone name this animal? Probably a lot of you are thinking like some kind of jackrabbit. But I promise you most people don't know this species because I sure didn't until I started looking into it. This is the white-sided jackrabbit. It is a unique species of jackrabbit, similar to the stuff we have out here, but its own discrete species that's only found in one tiny part of New Mexico. In fact, there's only about 45 of them total in the United States, even though it's one of the species that we have in the US. There's a lot more of them in Mexico, but a pittance of them in the US. These species are also not federally protected. Should they be? Like, where's our logic? If the 45 that are in New Mexico die out, the species is going to still be there. There's tons of them in New Mexico, or sorry, in Old Mexico. Does it matter if we still have our 45 white-sided jackrabbits in New Mexico or not? Well, for some species, the answer to that's easy. There's some species you can really point to and be like, that's an iconic species. That's the bald eagle. That's the panda. That's the flagship. That's the thing that represents us. Or this is a species like the panda that's only found in our country. So of course we need to be the ones that step up. How do we build narratives around things that you might never have heard of? Or address this idea of like, does the white-sided jackrabbit deserve attention from the United States, knowing that it's not something that most Americans will ever see or care about? So those were the 2 problems I set out to address. And I'm gonna walk you through the project that I did to build new narratives around this. I'm gonna actually move kind of quickly through the boring parts. But in short, I went and I grabbed a bunch of publicly available information from the IUCN, the International Union on the Conservation of Nature. I grabbed data for every single vertebrate species that lives on land, every mammal, bird, fish, amphibian, reptile? Yeah, out there, and figured out what countries they all live in. Did a bunch of coding, but that stuff's all boring. And then tried to think about how we view whether the community of species in one country is unique or not. So I'm gonna take a really quick timeout to walk you through some basic ideas of set theory to show you exactly what I was trying to accomplish. Let's think for a second about 2 different sets of discrete objects, group A and group B. You can see right here, I put some numbers in them. Obviously there's some overlap between the 2, right? You see some numbers that are shared between them. What is the overlap of them? What's the union of the 2? And you can see that 4, 5, and 6 occur in both sets A and B. This is the core of the idea of similarity, something that biologists use to compare gene pools, species in different ecosystems, 2 different places all the time. There's countless numbers of different coefficients you can calculate. You can make something, for example, called a Jaccard index, where you just say like, all right, how many species are shared versus how many are there in total between the 2 places, and say how similar both those areas are. However, everything out there right now is really rooted in this idea that we think that these 2 groups are similar in some sort of way, and we care about the similarity. I wanted to flip this idea on the end and say, I don't really care about group B. All I care about is like, what is unique about group A? How much of group A isn't being represented somewhere else? So looking at this again, we can say that the Jaccard index of A and B right here is 3/8. But what if B were bigger? What if there were a lot more species in B? Suddenly the similarity would change. You'd say 3/13. And that's, again, fine if you're trying to compare 2 places. But from the view I was trying to take, I don't care about that. For me, I don't really care about how big the comparison is. All I really want to know is like, how much of A is not being represented by another group? How much of group A is unique to group A? So I decided to go and calculate what I call uniqueness. There's no name for this coefficient. The closest I could find is it technically is the complement of the inclusion coefficient. But I went and calculated this for every country in the world. Pretty much what I said was, for any country, what's your most nearest or most similar country? let's take the country that has the most similar groups of animals in there, and then subtract out the overlap, and just look at the ones that remain in your place, in your country. So the ones in blue, and then divide that by the total number of animals. So a real quick example would be, if we looked at just the mammals in the United States, there are 428 mammals that you can find in the United States. I then looked up what's the closest country in terms of composition. Mexico, unsurprisingly, has the closest group of mammals. There are 488 species of mammals in Mexico, but these are not the same groups. Mammals in the US are not a subset of what's in Mexico. In fact, you only see kind of a mild amount of overlap. 181 mammal species are found both in the US and in Mexico, leaving 247 species in the US that you can't find in our next most similar community. So then I would take 247 and divide over 428 and get a uniqueness of 0.58. If you took the mammals in the US, compared them to the most similar community out there, well, almost 60% of species in the United States would not be represented, saying that we have a kind of unique mammal community. Moving forward, you would do the exact same with Mexico. Right, take Mexico and say what country has the most similar mammals. In this case, it would be Guatemala, and do the exact same thing. There's a huge amount of overlap with Guatemala, and Mexico would have 301 species that weren't represented in Guatemala that are just in Mexico, divided by the total number of 488, giving it a coefficient of 0.62. So why am I doing this? Because it turns out when you look at just endemic species, just species that are only found in one country, it's really skewed. Some countries have a ton of endemic species, and then the rest really don't have any. So if I showed you this map and said, where is endemism, the idea of our country has unique animals, a motivating factor for conservation, you would probably just point to the 5 countries in red. Like all of sub-Saharan Africa, most of Europe and the Middle East, there's not a lot of endemic mammals to say these are just our animals that we need to protect. We need to come up with new motivations, new explanations to say why countries should care about protecting the animals that they have. So let's compare this slide to what I calculated. How unique is your mammal species, or your mammal community? And this shows what percentage of your mammal community is unique to your nation when compared to the most similar other country. And suddenly, things pop out a little bit more. Suddenly, a lot of countries that don't have a ton of endemism have a collection of organisms that are unique to themselves. Turns out, lots of countries out there in the world are really, really, really unique when you think about them as a community, instead of just a bunch of discrete species that might be shared between a lot of other places. No two countries are really the same in terms of the collection of organisms that live there. You can also represent it this way. This is kind of a clunky figure. I'm still trying to figure out the best way to communicate it. But on the bottom in red, we have countries ranked by endemism. So that red line is essentially the number of endemic species for that country. And for most countries, it's really low. In blue, though, we have what percentage of your community is unique to your country. That jumps up a lot for a lot of those countries that have very low endemism. You can say that there are countries out there that don't have too many unique single species, but lots of countries that are unique in terms of the collection of species that they actually have out there. And it suddenly gives a lot of these other countries something to point to say, this is our own. This is something that only we have. And the thing that is unique there is the collection, not the actual individual component. Same thing with birds. Birds, as many of you know, migrate a bunch. Birds are quite shared. Very few countries have birds that only occur in one nation. But because birds are kind of chaotic little organisms, the actual composition of birds in your community is pretty unique all over the world. Even if you're sharing your bird species with lots of other neighbors, you still have a pretty interesting collection of the birds that actually occur in your country. And then lastly, here's for all of our vertebrates out here. When we think about just endemic vertebrates in the world, it's those same hotspot countries. But when we think about unique vertebrate communities, it looks a lot different. Endemism is a really, really, really polarized thing. In fact, very few countries have lots of endemic vertebrates. 31 nations in the world have 0 endemic vertebrate terrestrial species, where there's no species you can point to with a spine and say that this only lives here. And 105 of 198 countries have fewer than 10 endemic vertebrate species. So that means the vast majority of countries can't really say here's the thing that are uniquely ours at a species level and use that to motivate conservation. But when you flip it around and think about it at the community level, every single country in the world has a unique community of vertebrates. No two countries are the same when you say what actually lives here, with one minor asterisk. Turns out there are a few that have 0, but they're kind of weird countries. Monaco, Palestine, San Marino, and the Vatican are the only ones that actually have zero uniqueness. And you'll notice that most of those are just like city-states. Sure, the Vatican, that is like surrounded by Rome, has nothing special about it, but I think we're okay there. The Pope has more to worry about than like conserving pigeons or whatever. But every other country that matters, or every other country that has like a sizable territory and not any of these like strange uniquenesses in their sovereignty, has their own unique pot of organisms. Everything from landlocked countries to remote island nations has a unique group of terrestrial organisms that makes them different than everyone else in the world. No two countries can look at each other and say, yeah, we have exactly the same thing that you have. In fact, it's something that we can use to really exemplify why countries should care about conserving organisms in their own boundaries, even if you might not think about them as biodiversity hotspots. I'll pick on Turkey really quick as an example. Turkey doesn't have much in the way of endemism. Not a lot of unique animals to Turkey. Of their endemic organisms, it's pretty much all fish. 7 endemic mammals, no endemic birds. If you were to just look at their scaled endemism, they'd be about 9%. But if you look at Turkey as a collection of unique organisms, it's actually pretty unique. 40% of Turkey's vertebrate community is not represented by any other single country. They have their own group of organisms that is unlike their nearest neighbor in any way. Turkey suddenly has a reason why they should care about every single one of their organisms, because 40% of what they got helps define them as Turkey, makes them unique from other countries around them. So, as we're starting to close up, I want to hear from you really fast. What animals did you think about when I said, what defines the United States? Cool. Lark bunting, pronghorn, bald eagle. Can people just shout out like 1 or 2 other ones?
Bison.
Bison, what? Turkeys. Rattlesnake, yeah, awesome. Those are all very iconic organisms that help define the United States. Those organisms are found across many different ecosystems and many different countries. There's bald eagles in Canada. There's rattlesnakes in Mexico. None of the things we named are uniquely American, but together, if I showed you a picture of like a bald eagle next to a pronghorn, next to a rattlesnake, you'd be like, yeah, that's a very American scene that we just put together. Every place in the world, every country has their own unique wildlife, just like every country has its own unique culture, sets of languages, food, communities. It's one of these things that we really can point to now and say, like, this is part of what makes the United States the United States. What makes Turkey, Turkey. What makes Mexico, Mexico, is the fact that we have these unique communities. The question now, of course, is like, is that enough for people to latch onto? And I know I'm like right at time right now, but if you'll bear with me just a couple more moments, I want to just show you a few reasons why I think, yes, in fact, wildlife is truly part of culture and can be something that we can get people to latch onto. First is that the proof is sort of in the pudding. When we think about some of our major and totemic examples of wildlife governance, culture is always a big part of it. This is taken from the first couple paragraphs of the Endangered Species Act. The number 3 motivation for why the ESA, the Species Act, exists is that these species of fish, wildlife, and plants are of aesthetic, ecological, educational, historic, recreation, and scientific value to the nation. The US government saying, because they look cool and they're part of our history, is why the Endangered Species Act exists. One of the weirdest but also most interesting pieces of legislation is the Wild Free Roaming Horse and Burro Act. And it says that wild free roaming horses and burros are living symbols of the historic and pioneer spirit of the West. One of the reasons why horses are more protected than you on public spaces is because they're a piece of like living culture and heritage. Not for any ecosystem function, not for any sort of biological reason, but because of cowboy stuff is why this federal legislation exists. Here's some money from every single one of those countries I showed you right at the beginning of this lecture. And you can see that people love putting animals on coinage and dollars. Like, they are icons. It's every single country in the world agrees that the critters that live there is like part of what we're showing off. It's not just old buildings and dead people. It's also leopards and lions on the burr and a weird char on the Icelandic kroner and kudus on the Namibian dollar and a woolly lemur, I think, and on the Madagascar ariari. And it's also in all of our stories. I myself am half Korean. Our foundational myth about being Korean is that a bear came from the sky and mated with a tiger, and those are iconic animals for us. If any of you saw K-pop Demon Hunters, you might have seen this derpy-looking tiger right there. Turns out that's a really important part of Korean heritage. It's what we call the dumb tiger, the pabo horangi, which really means stupid tiger, and it's a representation of the nobility and the government being kind of idiots, while like the working class peasantry are the noble magpies. And it's actually outlasted tigers on the peninsula. There are no more tigers in Korea, but tigers as a symbol of Korea is still so important that it was in the most viewed movie of last year. And I'll end right here. Like, why do we care? Because this diversity of like cultural touchstones are the things that we go to time and time and time again to reinforce why nations even exist in the first place. Like I said before, they're kind of arbitrary polygons. So why do they exist? Well, because inside of that arbitrary polygon is a weird collection of things that can hopefully form a cohesive culture. You can think of iconic things like crowds at Arches National Park, the Statue of Liberty, American apple pie as being like these cultural touchstones that most Americans will immediately point to. And I would argue things like our American avocets, our pronghorns, and our Western tiger salamanders are just as important for saying the thing that we call Colorado, the thing that we call the United States, is also defined by the fact that no other box you can draw has the same animals living inside of it. They're unique to us and define us. And if we lose any one of those things right there, our country becomes poorer. Our identity degrades with it. So I'll end right there. Thank you so much for your patience. Would love to hear your thoughts about this and hope you at least got to see some fun animal pictures today. I'd also really love to thank Dr. Christine Smith, UGR, Fort Lewis for supporting this, and also my dad for making the trip down from Seattle to be here today. So thanks, Dad.